It was a typical afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and everything seemed peaceful. Jamila, a 16-year-old black teenager, was walking home from school, her backpack slung over her shoulder and her headphones on. She was just trying to get back to her house to relax after a long day of school. The streets were calm, and she didn't think anything out of the ordinary would happen. As she walked past a parked police car, she heard a voice call out to her, "Hey, stop right there!" Jamila pulled out one of her earbuds and looked around. She was confused. She had never seen this officer before. She glanced at the quiet street and couldn't figure out why she was being stopped. "Is there something wrong, officer?" she asked, unsure of what was going on. "I need to see your ID," the officer said, stepping closer to her. Jamila froze. She had never been stopped by the police before. She didn't understand why he was asking for her ID. "I don't have my ID with me," she said nervously. "I'm just heading home." She hoped he would understand and let her go. But the officer's face tightened. He looked frustrated and suspicious, even though Jamila hadn't done anything wrong. "You think you can just walk around here without ID?" the officer snapped. "No one's above the law." Jamila's heart started racing. She didn't know what to say, but she tried to stay calm. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She just wanted to go home. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble," she said, trying to explain. "I'm just walking home. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't listen. Instead, his voice grew harsher. "You better stop lying to me. You're not above the law," he said, stepping closer. Jamila stepped back, feeling uneasy. She didn't understand why he was acting this way. She hadn't done anything wrong. But before she could speak again, the officer suddenly reached out and kicked her in the leg. The sharp pain took her by surprise, and she stumbled backward, almost falling. "What the heck?" Jamila cried, clutching her leg, trying to steady herself. She was in shock. She had never experienced anything like this before. The officer just stood there, watching her as if it was no big deal. Jamila's leg hurt, but what hurt more was the feeling of being wrongfully treated for no reason at all. "Don't make me do this again," the officer said, his voice cold. "If you don't want trouble, just stay quiet and wait for backup." Jamila felt helpless. She didn't understand why this was happening to her. She just wanted to go home. She looked around, but there was no one to help her. But despite the pain in her leg and the fear she felt, Jamila wasn't about to let the officer get away with this. She knew she had to do something. In her shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and dialed the number she knew would change everything. Her mom, Tamara, picked up the phone right away. "Mom, I need help. I need you right now. I'm at the corner of Maple and 5th. The police. The officer kicked me." Tamara's calm voice came through the phone. "Jamila, stay calm. Don't say anything. Keep the phone on. I'm coming now." The officer had no idea who Jamila's mom was, but once she said Tamara's name, the whole situation began to change. Tamara wasn't just any mother. She was a respected lawyer who had worked on countless cases fighting for justice. Her reputation was well known, and the officer suddenly realized he was in a situation far bigger than he ever imagined. As Jamila finished the call, she could see the officer's expression shift. His confident, aggressive stance began to falter. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the young black teen he was targeting to have a powerful ally on the other end of the phone. The balance of power was starting to shift, and the officer knew it. Jamila held her phone tightly, waiting for her mom to arrive. The tension in the air was thick, and the officer's earlier bravado was starting to slip away. The scene had gone from an unwarranted encounter to a life-changing moment. She was scared, but now she had hope. She wasn't alone. The officer, unsure of what to do next, stepped back slightly. Jamila stood her ground. Her mother was coming. The truth was about to come out, and the officer was about to face the consequences of his actions. As the moments passed, Jamila stood there, her phone still pressed against her ear, her heart pounding with anticipation. She could hear her mother, Tamara, on the other end of the line, speaking with calm authority. Tamara knew exactly what to do. Jamila had never felt more relieved. She wasn't alone anymore. Her mom, a well-known lawyer in their community, was on her way. Meanwhile, Officer Brackett stood in silence. His earlier anger had begun to fade as uncertainty crept into his mind. He had no idea who Jamila's mother was, but now, hearing the confidence in Jamila's voice, he started to realize he may have made a huge mistake. His hands, once firm and controlling, now hovered nervously at his side. He glanced at Jamila, who was still standing tall, despite the pain in her leg. She hadn't backed down. Jamila felt the power shift, but she wasn't about to get comfortable just yet. The officer had already shown his true colors by using force on her without any reason. Now, it was time for him to answer for his actions. She had to stay strong until her mother arrived. As the minutes passed, the officer began to fidget. He hadn't expected any of this. The power dynamic had completely flipped. Jamila, despite her fear and confusion, was now the one in control. The officer was waiting, but he was not prepared for what was coming next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tamara arrived at the scene. She stepped out of her car and walked toward Jamila, who still stood calmly, her eyes locked on Officer Brackett. Tamara's presence was commanding, even from a distance. She was a woman used to handling high-pressure situations, and she didn't let the officer's presence intimidate her. "Officer!" Tamara called, her voice clear and firm. She didn't need to raise it to command attention. Her reputation preceded her, and everyone in the neighborhood knew her name. She was a force to be reckoned with. Officer Brackett turned around to face her, his posture now less confident than it had been. He could tell that this wasn't just any parent. This was Tamara, a woman with power and influence. She was known for fighting for justice in the community, and now her daughter was at the center of a potential scandal. "Is there a problem, officer?" Tamara asked, her voice still calm but laced with authority. "I was just doing my job," Officer Brackett stammered, clearly uncomfortable under Tamara's steady gaze. He couldn't make eye contact. "Your job?" Tamara asked, her brow furrowing. What exactly did she do that warranted physical force? Kicking her, without provocation? You've crossed the line. Officer Brackett hesitated, clearly realizing he had no good explanation for his actions. Tamara wasn't done. She stepped closer, and the officer stepped back. "I'll have to file a formal complaint against you," Tamara said firmly. "Your actions have violated my daughter's rights. You don't have the right to treat anyone like this, especially not for something as trivial as walking down the street." At that moment, the officer understood that his career might be in jeopardy. Tamara's words hit hard. She wasn't just another upset parent. She was a powerful legal professional who knew how to take action. She was a woman who had fought for many people's rights, and now she was using her expertise to protect her own child. The officer opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. He was speechless. What could he say in his defense? The law was on Tamara's side, and he knew it. He wasn't dealing with just any parent. He was facing someone who would not allow this injustice to go unchallenged. Tamara took out her phone and quickly began recording. "I'm going to make sure your actions today are documented. she said coldly. "I'll be in touch with your superior officers, and I'll make sure this goes to court if it needs to." The officer's face went pale as he realized that he had just been caught in a lie. His hands trembled as he tried to compose himself, but he couldn't hide his guilt. He knew he had made a serious mistake, and now he was going to pay for it. Jamila stood quietly by her mother's side, finally feeling empowered. It was clear that the officer wasn't going to do anything further. He had been exposed, and now it was time for the truth to come out. As the situation calmed down, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Tamara turned to Jamila, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You did well, baby. You stayed strong. You were right to call me. No one should ever treat you like that." Jamila, still in shock but now feeling a sense of relief, nodded. "I didn't know what to do at first, but when I heard you on the phone, I knew you'd make things right. I didn't want to back down, but I was scared." Tamara smiled softly. "I know, sweetheart, but you don't ever have to be scared when you know the truth. And now, this officer knows the truth too." The officer stood there, humiliated. The community was starting to gather around, watching the scene unfold. People whispered to each other, realizing what had happened. Tamara was known in the community, and everyone knew she would fight for justice. They weren't going to let this incident go unnoticed. Soon, news spread that Tamara had filed a formal complaint. The officer's behavior would be investigated, and his actions were now in the spotlight. The department had no choice but to take action. The officers who had witnessed the event were also questioned, and the department began reviewing its policies on racial profiling and police misconduct. This was a turning point, not just for Jamila, but for everyone in the community. Tamara's action wasn't just about protecting her daughter. It was about sending a message to everyone that racism and abuse of power would not be tolerated. It was a reminder that when wrong is done, there are people who will stand up and fight for what's right. Jamila learned a valuable lesson that day. Always stand up for yourself, and know that when you're in the right, you're never alone. Her mom's identity and her power to make things right were there when she needed them the most. As soon as Tamara finished speaking to Officer Brackett, she wasted no time in making sure that the situation was fully documented. She calmly recorded the conversation, ensuring that every detail of the incident would be preserved. Officer Brackett, still standing there, stunned and humiliated, looked around nervously as the surrounding crowd began to whisper and take notice. The power dynamic had completely shifted. This wasn't just a moment of injustice anymore. It was a turning point. Jamila stood by her mother's side, still processing what had just happened. She had never expected her afternoon walk home from school to end like this. But now, seeing her mother in action, she realized that her mom was a force to be reckoned with. The police officer who had kicked her just minutes ago was now the one on the defensive, and Jamila could feel the weight of that change. Tamara continued to speak, her voice calm yet firm, making it clear that there would be consequences for Officer Brackett's actions. She was ready to take the next steps to ensure that justice was served, not just for Jamila, but for anyone who had been wronged by those in positions of power. "You need to understand that what you did was completely unacceptable," Tamara said, her voice filled with authority. "You cannot just kick someone because you feel like it. This is not how you're supposed to treat anyone, let alone a young girl who is just minding her business." The officer, his face turning pale, nodded slightly. He knew he had made a huge mistake. There was no way to justify his actions, especially now that he knew who Jamila's mother was. It was clear that Tamara was not only going to make sure this didn't go unpunished, but that this moment would serve as a lesson to the officer and to others watching about the consequences of abusing power. Tamara looked around at the gathered crowd. She knew that the eyes of the community were on them. This wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about changing the way people saw authority, about showing them that it was possible to hold power accountable. Everyone who witnessed this will be part of the record, she continued. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to make sure the system works for everyone, not just those in uniforms. Jamila looked around at the people watching them, most of whom had stayed silent when the incident first happened. But now, the tension had shifted. People were no longer looking away. They were beginning to pay attention to recognize that silence in the face of injustice wasn't going to help anyone. Some nodded, understanding that this wasn't just about a single incident, but about something much bigger, about ensuring everyone was treated fairly. I'm going to take this further, Tamara said. And trust me. This officer will be held accountable for his actions. We are going to make sure this doesn't just disappear into the background like so many other cases. This will be different. As Tamara spoke, Jamila felt a surge of pride. Her mother was not just talking about right and wrong. She was acting. Jamila had always known that her mom was strong, but seeing her in action, seeing how she didn't back down, even when faced with authority, was something else entirely. It was a lesson in courage, and Jamila knew she would carry that lesson with her forever. Tamara turned back to the officer. I want your badge number, and I want to know who your superior officer is. I will be filing a complaint. Officer Brackett hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. He was trying to regain some semblance of authority, but he couldn't. He had already crossed the line. There was no way to go back from what had happened. The damage was done. I'll make sure you get all the information, he said quietly, realizing there was no way out of this situation. Tamara nodded. Good. You need to realize that this doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone in this community, and it's time to change the way things are done. The police officer seemed to shrink before them, realizing that this moment had exposed a lot more than he expected. Tamara's words carried weight. The officer had always assumed his badge gave him power, but now he understood that real power came from knowledge, from doing what was right, not from abusing authority. By now, the news was starting to spread. The crowd around them had started to disperse, but many of the neighbors who had been silent were talking amongst themselves. It was clear that something had shifted in the community. People who had once stayed silent now seemed more aware of the injustice that could happen right in their own neighborhood. Tamara's actions had sparked something deeper, a realization that things had to change. As Tamara and Jamila prepared to leave, the officer stood there, still holding on to the shame of what he had done. He was no longer the confident authority figure he had been just moments ago. Instead, he was the one being judged by everyone around him. Jamila turned to her mother, a sense of empowerment flooding through her. "Mom," she said softly, "thank you for standing up for me." Tamara smiled down at her daughter. "You did great, sweetheart. You stayed calm and didn't let him get away with it. That's the most important thing. You never back down when you know you're right." As they walked away from the scene, Jamila felt a new sense of confidence. She realized that the fight for justice wasn't just something for the powerful people in the community. It was for everyone. Her voice mattered, and so did the voices of everyone who stood with her. Together, they had changed the course of this day, and Jamila knew that this was just the beginning. The officer's actions were soon investigated, and it wasn't long before the department was forced to make a statement. Officer Brackett was put on administrative leave while an internal investigation was conducted. The pressure was on the police department to answer for his behavior. and they couldn't ignore it. The investigation into Officer Brackett's actions moved forward quickly. The pressure on the police department grew. Tamara wasn't going to let this go easily, and she made sure that the department couldn't ignore the issue. She had made a promise to her daughter, and now she was going to make sure that the officer who had kicked Jamila was held accountable for what he did. The department issued a public statement about the incident, but there was no denying the facts. Officer Brackett had stepped out of line. The news spread quickly in the community. People began to talk. The once silent witnesses who had seen the whole thing unfold were now starting to share what they had seen. The officer's abuse of power was being exposed. At first, Jamila felt a little overwhelmed. She had never imagined her walk home from school would end in such a dramatic way. But as her mother handled the situation with strength and confidence, Jamila started to feel proud. She saw how her mom didn't just fight for herself or for Jamila. She fought for what was right. Jamila realized that she could do the same. Tamara worked with her colleagues, filed formal complaints, and made sure that Officer Brackett's actions would not go unpunished. She also reached out to several of her contacts who worked in civil rights and police reform. This was not just about one officer. It was about a system that needed to change. In the days that followed, Jamila became more involved in the conversations happening around her. Her mom's connections gave them a platform, and soon, local activists and concerned community members were coming together to discuss the importance of police accountability and racial justice. Jamila attended town hall meetings with her mom, where they spoke out about what happened and shared their story. Jamila, who had once been a quiet observer, was now part of a growing movement. Meanwhile, Officer Brackett was placed on administrative leave. The investigation was thorough, and it became clear that his actions were not just an isolated incident. His history of inappropriate behavior came to light. Other reports surfaced about previous instances where he had used excessive force or treated people unfairly. The truth was that this wasn't the first time Officer Brackett had acted inappropriately, but this time the community was demanding answers. The department had no choice but to take action. Officer Brackett was terminated from his position. The news made headlines, and people all over the city began to discuss how this incident had brought important issues to the forefront. Accountability was key, and now people were starting to see that real change was possible if they stood together. The day Officer Brackett was fired, Tamara and Jamila stood together in their living room, watching the news report on TV. It felt like a victory, but Tamara knew this was just one step. There was still much work to be done to ensure that racial bias and police misconduct didn't continue unchecked. Tamara turned to her daughter. "This is a big win, Jamila. But it's just the beginning. We've got to keep pushing for more change. We need to make sure this never happens again." Jamila nodded. "I get it now, Mom. I thought you were just trying to make it right for me, but it's bigger than that. It's about everyone." Tamara smiled and hugged her daughter. "Exactly. We are not just standing up for ourselves, but for everyone who's been hurt by this system. We're doing this for the future." The next few weeks saw more and more people join the conversation. The town meetings grew larger, and local news outlets continued to report on the importance of holding police officers accountable. Jamila's voice, once quiet and unsure, had become part of a larger movement for change. She started to speak at public forums, telling her story and sharing how it felt to be targeted simply for walking down the street. The community began to come together. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke out. They realized that they had a responsibility to ensure that everyone in their community was treated fairly. People were starting to ask questions that were long overdue. What kind of changes were needed in the police department? How could they make sure these kinds of incidents never happened again? The conversations were difficult, but necessary. The town started a new initiative to address the need for diversity training in the police force. New policies were introduced that emphasized de-escalation tactics, community engagement, and respect for all individuals, regardless of their race. Accountability measures were put into place, including regular reviews of police behavior and mandatory sessions for officers to learn about implicit bias. Jamila and her mother didn't stop there. They continued to work with other community leaders to push for even more reforms. Lawyers, activists, and community organizers came together to create a coalition dedicated to improving the relationship between law enforcement and communities of color. They weren't just focused on Jamila's case. They wanted to make sure every citizen felt safe and respected in their own neighborhood. Jamila's experience had opened her eyes to the injustices that many people faced every day. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of a larger movement. Her voice mattered, and, together with her mother and their community, they were making a real difference. The day Officer Brackett was fired was a turning point. It showed that when people stand together and demand justice, change is possible. It was a lesson in the power of standing up for what is right and the importance of holding those in power accountable. For Jamila, it wasn't just about this incident. It was about knowing that as long as people were willing to speak out and fight for justice, things could change. She was determined to continue being a voice for those who didn't have one, and to always stand up for what was right, no matter what. As the investigation into Officer Brackett's actions continued, Jamila and her mother, Tamara, continued to make their voices heard. They were determined not to let this incident fade into the background like so many others before it. Tamara knew that this case could be a turning point, not just for her daughter, but for the entire community. She knew it was more than just about seeking justice for Jamila. It was about fighting for a better future for everyone. Tamara had been in the legal world long enough to understand the importance of persistence, filing complaints, working with activists, and meeting with local leaders. These were just a few of the steps they had taken. The process wasn't quick, but every conversation, every meeting, and every protest made a difference. It was clear that Jamila's story was beginning to spark something in the community. More and more people were becoming aware of the injustices that so many had been living with. Word of the incident had spread throughout the neighborhood. People who had previously stayed silent were now beginning to speak up. Neighbors who had witnessed the incident started coming forward, sharing what they had seen. They began to realize that they couldn't remain quiet any longer. Jamila's case had made it clear. Racial profiling, police misconduct, and discrimination had been taking place under their noses for too long. The community, once divided and uncertain, began to rally together. Citizens organized meetings to discuss how they could change the way things were done. There were passionate discussions about reforming the police department, holding officers accountable for their actions, and establishing better relationships between law enforcement and the communities they served. Tamara was proud to see how people were coming together. It wasn't easy, but change was possible. The movement wasn't just about one police officer. It was about improving the entire system. Jamila had already become a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice, but now her story was inspiring others to take action as well. At a town hall meeting, Jamila and Tamara spoke alongside activists, lawyers, and community leaders about the importance of police accountability. They shared their experience and explained how the system needed to change to ensure that everyone was treated equally. Tamara emphasized that justice wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about making sure that such incidents never happened again. "We have to keep pushing for fairness," Tamara told the crowd. Every time we speak out, we move one step closer to a world where no one has to fear being targeted just because of the color of their skin." The room was filled with energy and determination. Jamila had become a voice for change, and her bravery had sparked others to join the fight. Community leaders and activists shared ideas about how to improve local police training, introduce anti-bias programs, and make sure that the police force was more representative of the community it served. Public support for Jamila and her family grew. News outlets covered the story, and more people became aware of the need for change. The police department had no choice but to act. Officer Brackett, once confident in his position, was now under serious scrutiny. The department couldn't ignore the growing pressure from the community. The investigation into his actions continued, and soon his history of misconduct was uncovered. In the following weeks, the police department was forced to confront the systemic issues that had been exposed by Jamila's case. Officer Brackett was officially terminated from the force, but that wasn't the end. The department knew it needed to do more. They began to implement new policies, including mandatory anti-bias training for all officers, community policing initiatives, and regular reviews of police behavior. These changes weren't just about making headlines. They were about ensuring a lasting impact on how police interacted with the community. Despite the victory, Tamara knew the work wasn't over. The changes were important, but real progress meant that everyone had to continue working together. She encouraged the community to keep pushing for reforms and to continue speaking out about the issues that mattered. Jamila's journey had shown that one person's voice could change everything. Jamila, too, was realizing the power of her voice. Her experience had transformed her from a regular teenager into a young activist who knew that she had the ability to bring about real change. She started speaking at local events, sharing her story, and encouraging other young people to stand up for what they believed in. Jamila was no longer afraid to speak her mind, knowing that her voice mattered. Her journey also gave her a new perspective on the importance of knowledge. She understood the power of knowing her rights and how much of a difference that made in a situation like hers. With her mother's support and guidance, she became more determined to pursue her dreams of becoming a lawyer, someone who could fight for justice, not just for herself, but for others who had been wronged by the system. Jamila was now on a path to becoming a leader in her own right. She was using her experience to educate others, especially her peers, on how to protect themselves and how to stand up when they see injustice happening around them. Jamila's story had become a lesson in courage, and she was determined to share that lesson with the world. The community had made it clear. They weren't going to stay silent anymore. The movement that Jamila's story had sparked was growing. People were organizing, speaking out, and standing together. The message was clear. Everyone deserves to be treated equally. Racial injustice and police misconduct would no longer be ignored. Jamila's mother, Tamara, watched as the community grew stronger, more united in their pursuit of fairness. She was proud of how far they had come, but she also knew that the fight was far from over. This was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward justice. But Jamila and Tamara knew one thing for sure. As long as they kept standing up, change was possible. They had proven that one act of courage could start a ripple that could eventually transform an entire community. The investigation into Officer Brackett's actions didn't take long. The evidence was clear. Witnesses came forward, and soon his history of racial profiling and excessive force started to surface. The pressure from the public, combined with Tamara's legal expertise, forced the police department to act quickly. Jamila and Tamara watched closely as the department placed the officer on administrative leave, while they conducted a thorough investigation. Jamila's heart raced. She had never imagined her walk home from school would lead to something so serious. But now, the officer who had hurt her was about to face consequences for his actions. The community, which had once been silent, began to speak up. More and more neighbors came forward, telling their own stories of being treated unfairly by police officers in the past. It was clear now that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about the system. It was about racial profiling, misuse of power, and injustice that had been allowed to go unchecked for too long. Officer Brackett's termination from the force was inevitable. The public outcry grew louder, and there was no way the police department could ignore it. The officer, once a symbol of authority, was now facing the consequences of his actions. He was fired from the police force, and the community watched as the justice system worked for the first time in a long while. As Tamara had predicted, this wasn't just a victory for Jamila. It was a victory for everyone. The officer's career had been ruined, and the department knew that there would be further scrutiny of their practices. This was the beginning of change. Outline 8. A call for change. 600 words. With the officer gone, the work didn't stop. Tamara and Jamila weren't content with just one victory. They knew this case had highlighted a larger issue, and they were determined to keep pushing for real change. They partnered with activists, community leaders, and legal professionals to ensure that the lessons learned from this case weren't forgotten. The police department, in response to the growing demand for accountability, introduced new policies. Officers began receiving mandatory anti-bias training, and the department committed to increasing community engagement to foster better relationships between the police and the people they served. Tamara's hard work and legal advocacy had led to this moment, but there was still more to do. The case sparked widespread discussions about police conduct and the need for reform. Jamila, once just a teenager walking home from school, had become a symbol of empowerment and resilience. With her mother's guidance, she began speaking at public forums, sharing her story, and educating others about their rights. She spoke about the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it may be. Jamila's voice had become powerful, and people in the community were beginning to see the change they needed. She knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, but she was no longer afraid to face them. In the months that followed, town meetings became regular. People who had once remained silent now spoke openly about the need for a fairer police system. The discussions led to new legislation aimed at ensuring that the rights of every citizen were protected. The case had sparked a movement, and it was clear that this wasn't just a one-time event. It was the start of a larger push for equality. As Jamila's confidence grew, so did her sense of purpose. She had learned that one voice could make a difference. With her mother by her side, she was determined to continue speaking out for justice. Together, they were part of something bigger, something that would change the community for generations to come. For Jamila, it wasn't just about what happened with the officer. It was about ensuring that no one would ever have to face what she did. She had become a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless, showing them that fighting for justice was worth it. And so, as the community came together, things began to change. Officer Brackett was gone, but the lessons learned from this incident would stay with them forever. It wasn't just a case of personal revenge. It was about standing up for what's right, demanding justice, and ensuring that everyone was treated fairly. As Jamila and her mother continue their journey for justice, their story shows that one voice can spark change. If you believe in fairness, equality, and standing up for what's right, Don't stay silent. Share this story. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation. Together, we can make a difference. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more inspiring stories like this one.